Today we are going to build and paint a Forge World Mechanicum Knight Styrix. It's a multi-part plastic and resin hybrid kit. The plastic components are your basic standard Age of Darkness Knight Questoris, minus the Canis Rex and Warden upgrade sprues. The resin components include your flare shield, siege claw with inbuilt IRAD cleanser, carapace, shoulder and greave armor, and the signature Volkite Chiora vial. The instructions are pretty standard for older Forge World kits. It's just a few pages, front and back printed in black and white. The Imperial armor logo really shows the kit's age. The Mechanicum Knight Styrix and accompanying Mechanicum Knight Megara were released in 2014 alongside the Horus Heresy Book 4, Conquest. This book brought the Questoris Knights as a playable faction to the Horus Heresy for the first time. There are some awesome color plates of various knights throughout the book, with one in particular catching my attention. A Knight Styrix of House Atrax. Atrax is a traitor household under the command of Archmagos Dracovac, and were present at a lot of key events of the Horus Heresy, including the Siege of Chthoniya. Forge World never released a transfer sheet for House Atrax, so I designed and printed my own. I made various sizes for knights, and also smaller ones for castellax and other automata. This is my first time building one of the Mechanicum Knights, so I want to start with the resin upgrade parts to familiarize myself with them. I clip all of the parts off and clean them with my hobby knife. A lot of people wash down their Forge World resin kits to remove mold release, but I have had no issues with adhesion just going straight to spray primer. Now, with all of our resin parts cleaned up and ready for assembly, we can move on to the plastic components. Starting from the bottom up, I clip the legs, feet, and waist assembly parts off the sprue. I carefully clean all of the excess sprue and mold lines with my hobby knife. Once everything is clipped and cleaned, I start assembling the legs and feet. While I have done a bunch of Questoris Knights, I still have to reference the instruction sheet from time to time, as there are a lot of small parts like pistons that are specific to each leg. I glue on the feet and move on to the waist. We can now glue our lower parts together. It's important that the waist is level and that both feet are firmly planted flat. Having a strong connection between the feet and the base will help with stability and durability when using the model as a game piece. I add the leg pistons and cabling. With our lower section done, it is time to move on to our torso and arms. I clip everything out of the sprue and repeat the cleaning process with my hobby knife. This can take a bit of time as there are a lot of parts in these knight kits. With everything clean, I assemble the torso and exhaust stacks. Once the torso is together, I move on to the shoulders before gluing the torso onto the legs. Our knight is now standing, and you can begin to take in how large this model actually is. I normally assemble everything pretty much by the instructions, but on our knight, I reverse the weapon arms. I did this because the armor plate on the Volkite Chiora vial has a bevel on it. The bevel is usually on the inside face of the weapon to act as a relief for the knight's legs. You see this on the Megara and a few other knights. I glue on the head, positioning it off to the left side, building off the direction of the left leg. Matching the feet and head accentuates intention and gives the model a sense of movement and direction. Now, with swapping the weapon arms, I opened a huge can of worms with the weapon's giant cable. I had to soak it in boiling water and bend it to work with the weapon on the opposite side. This took a lot of time and effort, and after doing it, I probably would have left the weapons as shown in the instructions to avoid this. There is some minor green stuff work to be done to fill in a few cracks in the cables from the reshaping process. The siege claw assembles as expected and can be built with the pincers open or closed. I chose to go with the pincers open. I positioned the hull-mounted graviton gun in the same direction as the head. I always imagine these weapons tracking with the knight's eye line similar to the Predator and his shoulder-mounted laser. I do minor green stuff work filling in the cabling and add some clumps to the base to look like uneven dirt. With such a large base, the uneven earth will make it look more natural and realistic. So here is our Mechanicum Knight Styrix ready for paint. We have our main chassis built as one sub-assembly. The Volkite Chiora vial, pauldrons, smaller armor plates, banner, greaves, and top carapace are separate and will be glued on as we paint them. I start with Citadel Chaos Black Spray and prime the entire chassis and all of our armor plates. I make sure to get full coverage on all sides, leaving no resin or plastic showing. I then switch to Citadel Lead Belcher and hit our chassis. You could use an airbrush for this step if you wanted, but I prefer the spray can as it's faster. Next, using Vallejo Model Air Metallic Steel, I airbrush a highlight over our chassis. I focus on the raised areas that would catch the most light. This will give some subtle variation to our silver metallics. Using Vallejo Model Air Anthracite, I paint this layer over our black and gray panels. It will give a subtle gray to our blacks and act as the base layer for our grays. Next, using Vallejo Model Air Gray, I airbrush the gray panels. This will brighten them up and add more contrast between our dark gray and black armor. I let these layers fully dry, and then I mask our shoulder pauldrons with tape before airbrushing with Vallejo Model Air Red. Then, using Vallejo Model Air Red RAL 3000, I add a second layer of red to our shoulder pauldrons. We now have the base colors on our armor panels, and it's time to get to brushwork. Using Citadel Runelord Brass, I paint the back section of the carapace and the detail on the head shroud armor. I then move to the chassis and paint the skull half of the head. I pick out details and paint them brass to break up our silver. When everything is washed down and the armor plates added, all of these details will be pretty subtle. I paint the muzzle of our Volkite Chiroville and the plating on the siege claw. Next, using Citadel Abaddon Black, I paint the joints between the leg and groin, the paneling on the siege claw, armor around the chassis-mounted weapon, paneling on the Volkite Chiroville, and the hoses that are all over the chassis and head. Then, using Citadel Retributor armor, I dry brush highlight over all of our brass. I don't worry about being super precise with it. We are going to wash all of our metallics down, and it will all blend to look like a nice burnished brass. Next, using Citadel Ironbreaker, I do another highlight over our brass. At this stage, you can touch up any brush slips over our silver chassis. Using Citadel Eshin Gray, I highlight over all of our blacks. For the larger black surfaces, I use an older brush and do a dry brush highlight. On the smaller hoses, I switch to a finer brush and do more of a loose edge highlight. Then, using Citadel Wordbearer's Red, I paint the eyes and lens on the chassis-mounted weapon. Notice how I constantly rotate the model to accommodate my brush angle. This helps with consistency and is something I do when painting any model, large or small. Using Citadel Mephiston Red, I highlight the lens on the chassis-mounted weapon and our knight's eyes. Next, I switch back to Citadel Retributor armor and paint the trim on armor panels on the Siege Claw and Volkite Chiroville. I turn to our carapace armor and paint all of the gold trim. One thing I love about Mechanicum is their use of both gold and brass. Most legions, other than salamanders, usually only use one or the other. When doing the trim, I noticed I forgot to do a small sliver of the brass, so I switched back to Runelord and painted the panel. I took this opportunity to add more brass to the Volkite Chiroville and the Graviton gun. Returning to Citadel Retributor armor, I paint the rest of our gold trim. I repeat the process of painting the trim on the rest of the armor panels. To keep the video short, we are going to focus on the carapace, and I will accelerate through the other panels. The trim process is the same for all gold trim, and you won't get a ton of value from seeing me paint more than one panel. Then, using Citadel Ironbreaker, I paint the trim around the detail on the head shroud armor and paint the details on the carapace. This includes the vents and cabling. I then switch to an older brush and do a dry brush over all of our gold trim and brass panels. To paint the small lenses on the carapace, I switch back to Citadel Wordbearer's Red for the base color, and then use Citadel Mephiston Red to do a highlight. Next, using Citadel Nuln Oil, I wash over the black and gray armor. I then wash all of the brass and silver details. Be careful not to get any Nuln Oil on our golds. We will wash those later. Moving to our chassis, I wash down all of the brass and black panels and details. The base of the chassis is silver, so it's okay if you have some spillover. You can be pretty generous with the wash. Then moving on to the chassis itself, I add some wash on areas that have high detail. The wash will break up the silver and sink into the cracks, making the details more visible and also looking like oil. I then switch to Citadel Agrax Earthshade and wash all of our golds. The Agrax will work similar to the Nuln Oil on our brass, but give the gold a warmer tone and enhance the contrast between the two metallics. I also add some Agrax wash onto our chassis, focusing on joints and areas that grease and grime would accumulate. Using Citadel Dryad Bark, I do a light sponge weather over our chassis. Try and go as light as you can, and then build your way up. If you go too heavy of a sponge weather and get big globs of paint, it will affect the model's perceived scale. This will add texture and simulate the look of small rust chips and dirt. I concentrate on areas that are the most exposed and that would receive the most wear and tear in a realistic setting. I sponge weather our armor plates and over our gold trim as well. Now we can glue our first armor panels onto our chassis. I first glue on the head shroud armor and then gently fit the carapace over the exhaust stacks and into place. As previously mentioned, we are going to blast through the other armor panels, repeating the same process we did for painting the gold on the carapace. First, a Citadel Retributor armor base over all of the trim, followed by a dry brush of Citadel Iron Breaker over all of the gold trim. Citadel Nuln Oil Wash over the black and red surfaces of the armor plates, carefully avoiding getting any on the gold. And finally, a Citadel Agrax Earthshade wash over all of the gold trim. When all of our armor panels are fully dry, we can glue them onto our chassis with our Volkite Chiroville and then hit them with a light sponge weather of Citadel Dryad bark. Our Mechanicum Knight Styrix is now starting to take shape. We just have the breastplate and banner to paint before we can move on to transfers. I purposefully painted these parts separate from the other armor panels as they require white. Let's quickly knock these out. I painted the silver chains and gold eagles with the same process as the carapace. Using Citadel Celestra Gray, I paint over the scroll nameplate on the chest plate and the face of our hanging banner. I then highlight the white scroll nameplate with Citadel White Scar, and then paint the front of the banner. The white will take a few layers. In the reference art, the banner is very dirty and tattered, so I'm not too worried about getting a super clean even white. If I did want that, I would have airbrushed the white and worked from there. Then using Citadel Nuln Oil Shade, I washed down the entire chest plate and banner, including our newly painted white details. I quickly returned to Citadel Dryad Bark and sponge weather our chest plate before gluing it onto our knight. Let's now transition to our custom House Atrax transfer sheet. I cut out an assortment of emblems and am going to mimic the Forge World color plate as closely as I can. These three are going to go on our banner and mimic what is on the Forge World color plate. These are for the back of our shoulder pauldrons, and these are for the front. This is going to go on our carapace. These are going to go on our greaves. This is a barcode that I trimmed off the Legion Command Squad transfer sheet. I just cut some of the script to look like a barcode. These two are going to go on our knees. This one, the Eye of Horus in the Mechanicum cog, was cut off of the Forge World Iron Hands transfer sheet. These skulls, also off the new Command Squad transfer sheet, also go on the carapace like the artwork. And then there are two emblems I cut out of the Mechanicum Tagmata transfer sheet. They are not in the color plate, but there are two emblems in white that are, and I'm going to use these in their place. I wet the target surface with water, and then I drag the transfers into place. I then use my hobby knife to gently move them into their final position. I take my time and slowly repeat the process for the other transfers. Once everything is dry, I use Walther's Solvaset and give the transfers a good coating. This will set the transfers into place and snug them down onto our armor plating. The legs still feel a little bare, so I added another emblem to the inside of the greaves. The large Cyclothraith emblems and swords on our greaves printed in a lighter red, so I painted a layer of Citadel Wordbearer's red over them to make the color better match the other emblems. Next, using Citadel Iron Breaker, I sponge weather over the entire knight. Again, I focus on the areas that would be most prone to wear. This layer simulates more recent battle damage. We can now glue the banner on. Then using Tester's Dull Coat, I seal our entire model and let it dry before moving on to some oils. I add some odorless thinner and oils to a peanut butter cup tray, and then I work them over all of the dark armor. Oils is a slow process, and I go pretty light on them so a time-lapse better illustrates their effect. I basically work around the cracks and rivets, letting the oils do their work. I then move to our silver surfaces and do the same. The silver is lighter than our armor and will have a more dramatic effect and look like oil, grease, and grime. Here you can see how much realism the oils add. Our silver metallics now look like heavy ancient machinery. It's still drying here, but this is usually about as far as I take it. I keep everything pretty subdued. If any oil is overly splotchy, you can take a brush with odorless thinner and smooth it out. Let's get to basing. Using PVA glue and an old brush, I paint the glue over the entire base. I then dip the base into a gravel and sand mix. The base is huge, so it takes a few dips from different angles to get full coverage. I then let everything dry before moving on to the next step. I paint a thick layer of Citadel Dryad bark. I apply it pretty heavy, and it helps seal the gravel to the base. Then I use Citadel Mournfang Brown and do a dry brush over the gravel. After that, I use Citadel Ushabti Bone and do another dry brush. Next, I wash the gravel with Citadel Reichland Flesh Shade. This will blend all of the brown tones and set around the model's feet. Finally, I use Citadel Steel Legion Drab and paint the ring around the base. This usually takes 2 layers for full coverage. Now that the base is done, I weather the model's feet with weathering powders and then seal the model with Tester's Dull Coat. I then return to the airbrush and paint a thin layer of Vallejo model air concrete around our knight's feet. This is to simulate newly added dust kicked up as our knight stomps around the battlefield. I then switch to Vallejo model air black and airbrush the tips of the exhaust stacks and muzzle of the Volkite Chiroville to look like soot and carbon buildup. Revisiting the Forge World color plate, the knight has really cool burning eyes I want to emulate. Using Citadel Iriel Yellow, I paint the center of our eyes. I then use Citadel Technical, Blood for the Blood God, and paint over the entire eye lenses. This will give a splotchy red texture and add some gloss shine to our eye lenses. Our Mechanicum Knight Styrix is now complete and ready to deflagrate the enemies of the War Master. I really enjoyed building this model, and am exploring the idea of building an entire banner of them led by Archmagos Dracovac. Studying the color plates and emulating them as closely as possible in my models is a theme throughout my collection, and extremely rewarding for me. Thank you all for watching. Please keep letting me know what models and units you would like to see painted, and stay tuned for more Age of Darkness videos.